my speech in three, two, one. The law has always evolved to govern new centers of power. We granted legal personhoods to corporations not because they are human, but because they act. Today, advanced AI systems act autonomously, unpredictably, and at scale. The law must evolve again. And this is why this motion has to stand. I'm going to be doing a few things today. One, a few layers of framing to give you my main argument for today's motion. Let's go into framing. Definitions for this motion. Firstly, this house refers to policymakers, governments, and relevant international regulatory bodies. Two, granting means to formally recognize through law and legislation. Three, legal personhood. This means a legal status that allows an AI entity to one hold rights and duties to be sued or, or held liable. And number three, advanced AI systems are systems that sustainably, autonomously act in a sustainable, autonomous ecosystem to make independent decision makings. And three, can perform large scale economic and societal impact without direct human control. So, moving on to our burden. Our burden for today is simple. To prove that granting legal personhood, one, reduces AI exploitation and abuse, two, allows for a more regulated system to be implemented, and three, allows for AI entities to be held accountable. We impose one simple mechanism for today's debate. For AIs to be given legal personhood, the company that has created this AI has to first, one, submit a detailed document highlighting its framework, and two, submit back end and front end code of this specific AI. Let me give you a specific scenario under this mechanism on what would occur for an AI given legal personhood. One, if an AI were to cause any harms to society or any international or national body, two things will occur. It will be trialed in court and be reviewed by a special legislative body that has been created by the government. After this review has occurred, prohibition of certain features that has caused direct harm, that has been the main cause to that direct harm, will occur. What this looks like in a real world scenario, for instance, recent cases of Grok AI being abused to create deep fakes, to create deepfakes from real life images that have been uploaded, will be prohibited for the time being for these legislative bodies to review this framework and implement regulatory frameworks to prevent such thing from happening in the future. What this does is it allows individuals to still benefit from the use of these AIs, but it prevents certain features that cause direct harm towards society. Moving on to my main argument for today on how this implementation can increase AI accountability. A few things we have to address first. Advanced AI systems exercise real power. What this looks like in a real world scenario, it controls financial markets. Two, it manages infrastructure. Three, operates autonomous vehicles. Four, influence medical decisions. And five, conducts military targeting. And these are high stake domains with large scale societal impact. Number two, we tell you that the current law assumes human control. What this looks like is that traditional liability requires a human actor, a clear intent of negligence, and a traceable chain of causation. However, why this model breaks in an advanced AI stance is that one, advanced AI learns post deployment. Two, it adapts unpredictably, and three, it makes probabilistic decisions. So this is why a responsibility fragmentation starts to occur when we can't determine who is the actual cause of these decisions made by AI, which is why we tell you on our side of the house, it is far better from a legislative perspective to hold these AI accountable as their very own entities. Now, we already see a problem. Now, to give you a perspective on this problem, let me give you one main example. The flash crash that occurred in US recently wiped nearly $1 trillion in minutes due to interacting algorithms. No single human directly ordered this crash. Thus, this harm occurred and accountability was blurred. However, on our side of the house, this won't occur because when AI does decisions like this, it will be held accountable, reviewed by a legislative force, and adapted so that it does not cause any further harm. And so we move on to why a side opposition might tell you, why don't we just sue the company? We tell you that one, corporations can restructure, dissolve, or offshore liability. Two, AI subsidiaries can be isolated. And three, blames can be shifted internally. So we tell you that by allowing AI to be recognized as a legal entity, we're giving this accountability for AI and preventing corporations from exploiting their power of holding or owning these specific AIs. Now we tell you how legal personhood creates direct accountability. By granting limited legal personhood, it allows AIs to be one, sued directly. Two, mandatory registration, like we mentioned in our mechanisms. Three, mandatory insurance pools. Four, asset holdings for compensation. And five, regulatory audits. And last but not least, license revocation, like we mentioned in our mechanism earlier as well. So we tell you, you cannot regulate what does not legally exist. So if AI is not legally registered in the legislative body as a legal person, we tell you that this is far worse inside oppositions. And thus, as the law evolves, as we move towards a society where we're using AI in far more advanced scenarios, we must adapt and we must register these AI bodies and we must hold them accountable. With all of that, vote for prop.
We thank you so much for your first speech. We now welcome the first speaker from opposition side. You also have 6 minutes. Here.
Hi, am I visible, audible, and my internet connection all okay? All right, thank
Yes.
you. Okay, I will be starting my speech. 1 second. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right. A tool does not become a person simply because it's powerful. The central question of this debate is whether entities that lack consciousness, intention, and any moral understanding whatsoever should hold rights. As opposition, in this speech, we will prove to you through our substantive that AI cannot meaningfully hold rights or duties because it lacks that moral agency. So, a couple of rebuttals before going into the main substantive here. So, the main rebuttal here is that if AI is found guilty in that sense, right, as described by the mechanism proposed by first proposition, the harmful features in that sense can be banned. So they argue that AI personhood is granted, and therefore, if an AI is found guilty, they can simply ban these harmful features in that sense, and until the proper safeguards or frameworks are in place, presenting meaningful accountability. Right. However, the first thing to understand is that this is regulation, not a benefit of personhood. Governments already ban unsafe products and suspend defective systems and things like that by imposing compliance standards, guidelines, and key requirements that AI companies need to show to these governments if their AI system discriminates or causes harm. That is why so many AI systems, for an example, have already gotten regulatory standards in place, and therefore already regulators can prohibit its use or require modification without recognizing it as a legal person, right? So we say that even if you do not have to try this in court, or you do not try this in court or give legal personhood, this still occurs on our side of the house through things like the EU AI Act, as well as other frameworks that are placed internally within companies to prevent abusive or behavior that can cause harm in that sense. So therefore, you do not need to grant personhood. And secondly, focusing on the idea of banning features, right? This shifts attention away from the real source of harm of the system, which is the actual corporate design choices as well as incentives within the AI system that causes it to actually make this solution, right? And it therefore causes the harm or causes the responsibility of these AI systems to shift away from things like government policy failures, companies not actually putting the proper safeguard in place, and instead blaming the AI for a solution or a responsibility that it has gotten due to structural failures within companies rather than within the system itself. Therefore, the reform that they are proposing would be highly superficial. The second thing, or the second main rebuttal, is how AI personhood actually increases accountability, right? So they argue that AI systems can actually operate post deployment with multiple interacting interfaces, especially and in situations where these interfaces or algorithms interact with one another and there's no clear human intent, then it's very difficult to find responsibility or get responsibility in modern day systems. However, this complexity in that sense does not eliminate eliminate human responsibility like they're suggesting. Every AI system is designed, trained, and deployed and profited from in that sense by humans and corporations. So even if there is multiple AI systems that interact without any human necessarily pushing a button asking for a specific prompt to be created, right? There are still companies that created the systems that manufacture these systems that can be held responsible. So the true accountability here needs to target power and profit rather than on their side how they shift blame like code and non-decision making and the non-decision make and the decision makers in that sense rather than the AI which is not the main decision maker rather than a system following a set amount of guidelines and a data set that has been created for it. Then going into the key substantive here, right, which is how AI cannot meaningfully hold rights and duties. What is the thesis of the argument? And the thesis here is that legal personhood requires there to be a capacity for a capacity to meaningfully hold rights and fulfill duties, right? AI then therefore fundamentally lacks this capacity. Two layers to this, and then one key example followed by a comparative. So to hold rights is not to merely possess a legal label. It is to have an interest in the law and to recognize that it is a worthy form of protection, right? It is to recognize that the law protects you and you should abide by said law. It is to hold a duty to hold a duty is to be capable in that sense of understanding the obligations in place and complying with them in a morally responsible way. AI systems do not have these interests and therefore do not and they also do not suffer. They do not value freedom in that sense, property or reputation. Therefore, any harm to an AI system is merely a quote unquote damage to hardware or data, which ultimately affects the human owner, right? Because you're actually hindering their capability in that sense. Similarly, duties require comprehension, right? And international compliance. Duties do not discriminate, for an example, against presupposed responses and things like that. Therefore, granting AI a right and duties creates a legal fiction in that sense that detaches the moral reality in which algorithms do not actually have this moral conduct to this system, and therefore it doesn't really work on their side. Layer two to this is talking about how there is distortion of the legal system, right? When courts try entities, they assess intent, negligence, as well as recklessness, right? And they do so in good faith. These concepts are grounded specifically in a mental state. If an AI can be tried in court, then judges must pretend that the AI either has intent, use liability, or have a pure outcome-based solution. And in both worlds, there's a conceptual confusion where we either hollow out legal standards of AI or we either anthropomorphize machines in court in that sense. And this weakens the legal coherence in place. Consider then this example, right? There's algorithmic bias in terms of hiring algorithms within Amazon, for an example, that discriminate against women. Under the current framework, their responsibility would fall on the company. However, what it would mean on their framework is if AI was tried as a legal person, then these discriminatory outcomes would be tried, and therefore AI itself cannot reform morally because it doesn't understand sanctions, so it's not able to absorb this structurally, right? So the way out here is that on our argument, it strikes the functional coherence, and if rights and duties are meaningless when applied to AI, then legal personhood is symbolic at best and destabilizing at worst. Therefore, so proud to oppose.
We thank you for that fine speech. Now we welcome the next speaker, who is the second proposer. You have 9 minutes.
Okay. Am I audible and visible?
Sure.
Okay. Nice. Let me first set up my timer. I have my timer with me here. And I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. The opposition wants a world where artificial intelligence systems can allocate hospital resources, control financial markets, and manage critical infrastructure, yet legally remain nothing more than property. Power without legal identity is not safe. It is a structural blind spot. So in this speech, I will do 3 things. First, response to their core objections. Second, show why regulation collapses without legal personhood. And third, demonstrate why accountability becomes incoherent without a defined legal subject. First, up to my rebuttals. The opposition makes 2 central claims. First, AI lacks moral understanding and agency, so it should not hold rights. Second, granting personhood shifts the responsibility away from governments and companies that should have the responsibility. I will take each in turn. First, the rebuttals of no moral agency, so no personhood. This is a category mistake. Legal personhood is not a moral reward. Corporations does not have those consciousness, emotions, or moral reasoning, but they should they still hold legal personhood. Why? Because they are persistent decision-making centers that really generate risk. Legal personhood is a governance tool. We grant it when an entity acts autonomously, controls resources, and produces legal significant consequences. So apparently, advanced AI systems increasingly meet the threshold. The question is not that does AI understand morality? The question is, does AI generate decisions that affect rights, safeties, and resources? If yes, then the law must have a way to regulate it directly. Their standard would undermine corporate personhood too. So either they abandon corporate personhood or they admit that personhood is functional but not moral. Now, up to my second rebuttals. These shifts blame away from humans. This is simply incorrect. Our model is not substitutive, it is additive. So we do not remove liability from companies, developers, or governments. We add a liability node at the level of autonomous systems because harm in those complex AI often involve those models creators, data providers, deployers, or operators. So without a central legal subject, responsibility fragments, and this fragmentation produces those blame shifting, delayed litigation, or victims struggling to identify a defendant. In this case, legal personhood centralizes a forcibility and it prevents those responsibility from dissolving across those supply chains. And this does not excuse those human failures that the opposition claims. These actually just add on some of the legal liability that the AI model should hold. And it will ensure those structural accountability at the level when decisions occurs. Now, let me move the core of our case. Why legal personhood is structural necessary? Madam Speaker, my argument is not that AI deserves recognition. My argument is that the rule of law requires it. When an entity exercises autonomous decision making that produces legally significant consequences, the law must recognize it as a barrier of duties and liabilities. I will prove two things. First, regulation is only coherent when duties attach to the locus of decision making. And second, accountability is only meaningful when liability enforceable against a defined legal subject. First layer, regulation must track where power sits. Modern regulatory the theory is very simple. We regulate decision makers. Banks are regulated because they allocate capitals. Corporations are regulated because they control resources. Hospitals are regulated because they allocate life-saving treatments. The same comes with AI. Regulations works by attaching those compliance duty, licensing requirements, or audit obligation, as well as giving out risk management standards. All of this requires a legal subject. Now think about the advanced AI system that we are now communicating and debating about it. Those that execute those autonomous trading strategies or optimize those supply chains at a national scale or even make safety sensitive medical or defense recommendations, they are big. These systems increasingly generate strategies beyond those direct human micromanagement. This is recognized by a lot of regulators themselves, like the EU AI Act, for example. They have already classified those high-risk AI systems that as requiring those system-level obligation because those traditional product liability models are insufficient for these AI high advanced AI systems. And here's the logical problem. If AI remains legally classified purely as a property, you cannot attach duties directly to it. Property cannot be licensed, be audited independently, or file compliance disclosures. Only legal subjects can. Therefore, if decision-making power increasingly sits within autonomous AI systems, regulation must attach at that level. How otherwise, the law will regulate ownership, not agency. And when power and regulation misalign, regulatory gaps emerge, and legal personhood corrects that misalignment that the opposition was creates. It creates a defined legal node that duties attach, those standards apply, and compliance is totally enforced. Now, up to my second layer, accountability requires enforceable liability. Now, think about accountability. For accountability to function in law, two conditions must exist. One, identifiable legal personality, and 2, enforceable consequences backed by assets. Historically, when those new risk-bearing entities emerged, such as those corporations during industrialization or legal personhood was introduced precisely to solve the problem of liability concentration and enforceability. Why? Because victims need a defined entity with asset holding capacity. Now, see about it. Today, advanced AI systems increasingly operate in ways that produce those market-wise economic effects, large-scale resource allocation of the decisions, or even safety-critical outcomes. These are big, again. And as this system self-learn and adapt, harm may arise through those emergent behavior rather than direct human command. In such scenarios, those liability tracing becomes extra complex. If there is no central legal entity attached to the system itself, those responsibility fragments across developers, data providers, or even corporate owners. And in our case, legal personhood actually consolidates responsibility at an operational level that leads everything to be accountable, I'll take it later, and makes the whole accountability more regulated in that case. And this allows us to require those mandatory insurance pool attached to the AI system and segregated liability reserve that create enforceable accountability. So in that case, to summarize it up, without a legal subject, enforcement remains indirect and structurally weaker. Now, let us be really fair to the oppositions. They are, of course, concerned about those moral confusions, overreach, or those diluting human rights that AI might not be able to compensate. But we also share that concern, and we do admit it. That is why our personhood is limited and functional. The real question for this house is which world better preserves the coherence of the rule of law. The opposition leaves autonomous system legally invisible and relies solely on indirect human liabilities. Yet, the proposition creates and defines legal identity, clear regulatory attachment, as well as a centralized enforceable accountability in our case. So, in a world of autonomous decision-making, governance requires structure, and we provide that structure. Madam Speaker, throughout history, whenever power escaped our legal categories, crises follow. AI systems are becoming autonomous actors in our economic and social order. If they can act, they must be accountable. If they generate risk, they must bear liability. Legal personhood is not a gift, it is a leash. And we proudly stand with proposition. Thank you.
Thank you for your fine speech. Now we welcome the second speaker, opposition side. You have 9 minutes.
Hi, give me like 30 seconds to organize my notes. Okay, just checking. Can I be seen? Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay then, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Imagine a computer sitting in court, projecting a Siri-like voice out of the mic, justifying to a panel of parents as to why the policy recommendations it gave that indirectly killed 5 of their children was perfectly fine. I think that's a ridiculous scenario, but one that might exist if you buy into side proposition. But second, think from the context in the mind of those parents and how angry they would be that the justice that the legal system is giving them is supposed to sound like an apology from ChatGPT Premium. Very proud to oppose. Three things in my speech then. First, strategic observations towards the side proposition. Second, constructive rebuttals. And third, a unique argument. Let's do one quick observation then about Prop's clear assumptions. They claim that without legal personhood on opposition side of the House, the individual autonomous systems that are advanced AIs will simply not be held accountable in the first place. We think this is inherently false because the status quo is still going to stand. Accountability is going to be pinpointed towards the developers and for the users who are given warnings about the fact that AI and their judgments can be inherently flawed. That whatever AI and ChatGPT and Premium says is only a disclaimer, has a clear disclaimer that it can be intuitively false, that you take that knowing, that you take that recommendation given that warning, and therefore if you do choose to act on it, you act on your own basis and absorb the very harm of the action that might be caused. But second then, let's do two rebuttals and note here how I engage directly with their frameworks. Let's take the first argument from Prime Minister, and this is the mechanization to granting legal personhood on side proposition. They say two things: you must first submit documents and second, disclose the AI frameworks. But panel note then that the prerequisite to passing legal personhood on side proposition is based on their best case, very stringent mechanization that is unlikely to be good. We prove this in two ways. The first issue is that your argument concedes that you give developers the right to go through X regulations to achieve such a status. The probability is that developers are unlikely to do so since it gives them no clear benefit, and given that AI developers are intuitively profit incentivized, unless that label is going to attract more investors of users, and this is noted unproven, so you can't just claim that benefit, this is just more legal loopholes. So therefore, it's likely developers are just going to maintain their status as a less advanced AI, and for better functions, they're just going to make you pay. They're not going to go through these legal loopholes in the first place. The second issue with this mech is that you require such developers to disclose their trade secrets through disclosing frameworks. We think two things. Firstly, there is such stringent and direct competition with other AI developers in status quo to create the best AI models. Panel, understand that no AI developer is going to do this, as they know that governments are intertwined with the biggest AI developers in their nation. What incentives do AI developers have to lose such an advantage by applying for a title with no clear benefit? Let's deal with the second argument from DPM then, and then I'll take your POI. The thesis is simple: why legal personhood is a structural requirement. Proposition explains this in two ways. They say that AI is generally used in structures like healthcare to make decisions, and I'm giving them their illustration. For example, AI is used to detect early cancer symptoms in patients. But second, they claim a second harm, that we can't claim compliance disclosures when people don't adhere to the presumably good recommendation that AI makes. But note how charitable I am by taking the best case scenario of Prop's argument. At the top of my response, let's just say that I'm going to deal with how AI doesn't make any good recommendations in my constructive. But second then, this argument assumes that compliance to AI policy recommendations is going to reduce the bad liability towards managers from disobedient workers. We think here there's an intuitive problem solution mismatch. Firstly, that workers, those working in high level areas, for example, those who are white-collar workers, shouldn't be taking their recommendations directly off AI. I should not be acting based off information that is compiled presumably on the internet, and I should therefore be using my own human judgment making and 20 years of expertise as a consultant at McKinsey. But second then, this doesn't really solve the issue that you take away the bad workers from such managers. I think that is a general legal requirement. If you don't listen to your legal work, to your manager, and you make a bad decision, then you should be liable for general legal action, and this is not exclusive to AI. Let's take your point then before my argument.
You say that developers don't want to lose a competitive edge by submitting these AI frameworks, but do you acknowledge the fact that governments are legally required to keep these frameworks from other private corporations?
I don't understand your POI when you say that governments are required to keep these frameworks from other corporations. Given that AI developers are private entities, you don't prove how all AI developers in the status quo are owned by the government. These are like capitalist corporations, and while we concede there's going to be some level of government overreach, by no means are AIs ruled by the governments themselves. The first argument then my first substantive then is simply why the recognition of legal personhood is unjust to both developers and users. Then quickly, let's do some quick characterization onto what advanced AI looks like. Two things. AIs, broadly speaking, are byproducts of large compounded data sets to give responses or decisions or judgments. But second, that advanced AI uniquely has the capacity to traverse larger data sets far beyond what developers have initially set out. This looks like two clear things. Firstly, generative AI that find patterns and come up with conclusions. And second, that advanced AI simply just has the physical capacity to do so because they probably just have more water cooling systems. But then this argument aims to prove why generative AI and existing data sets on the internet are simply very flawed and why it's simply harmful to set legal personhood to the general population. Three arguments then. The problem. We think that in the status quo, advanced AI encompasses generating conclusions from pre-existing data sets. These are flawed, and this is a very bad thing for two reasons to set legal personhood. One, that pre-existing data sets developers can access and can use for their own AI sets are often free and found on the internet. Two layers. First, that high-level, actual, fair research is often gate-kept behind paywalls and within democratic institutions, for example, Ivy Leagues. But second layer then, that these many AI developers increasingly come from nations with governments who possess controlling tendencies like China. For example, DeepSeek users can't ask information about Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, even though that technically happened because the Chinese government is so controlling, it automatically says it doesn't know anything about it. But second layer then, that few developers are going to initiate collaborations with a researcher, part of a country that is perceived as a geopolitical adversary, just to possess more accurate and well-rounded data sets. But again, rightfully so, because even if they had that intuitive one, in China they call it treason and then they shut down the whole AI company. Two, then, what does it mean? We think that first, the data sets the developers, broadly speaking, can access tend to be intuitively flawed as a collective. The premise is that given that research institutions have only existed within developed nations for the last 200 years, 100 and 200 years or so, and the developing nations are just starting to emerge in recent decades, we think that most data sets available on the internet are likely to come from Western nations and have bias towards what data Westerners were able to collect in the first place. But second layer then, that the AI developers in very controlling nations like China and Russia probably only have access to data that is state verified, and the bias is likely to be even worse because the research is going to reflect state interest because high controlling governments would only fund research that allow them to be put on the internet as long as it reflects what they want. So therefore, generative AI draws conclusions and gives suggestions on fundamentally flawed suggestions. So the problem then is that economic and policy recommendations on side proposition side of the house are going to be so unreliable, and then the problem is exacerbated by legal personhood because we deem these judgments as reliable enough that we give them legal personhood and the right that we can justify them according to their policy recommendations because we trust AI's judgment. Then opposition rejects the harm of flawed AI judgments. Two layers. One, we reject legal personhood and we say a societal consensus that AI is intuitively flawed, so any judgment made by individuals of authority are held accountable to the individual making them. Two, there's a broad societal warning that extends towards anyone using an AI. So we claim a unique opposition benefit that you just have to be cautious and you are held responsible for the decisions that you make, whether or not AI is involved with them. The impacts are very simple then. On opposition side of the house, firstly, we insulate developers from the unjustified data sets that exist in the first place. Second, we warn individuals from the fact that data sets are intuitively flawed, and when you act on them, you do so of your own authority. And three, we make the blanket claim that people as a whole cannot simply trust advanced AI systems and are unlikely to do so just because they have the term advanced in them. And the weighing is very simple. On side opposition, we give you clear policy recommendations, and when you act, you do so of your own merit. On side proposition, you defend computers in courts. Very proud to post.
All right, we thank you for that fine speech. Really, we want now to welcome the reply speech from opposition side. You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes for the reply speech, starting with the opposition side.
Thank you. Audible and visible.
Yeah, sure.
All right, thank you. All right, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Honorable judges, this debate comes down to one key question. Does AI personhood then strengthen accountability and the rule of law, or does it create symbolic responsibility while weakening the real enforcement? I'll weigh this in my speech through three key clashes. The first one about banning harmful features in that sense. So the proposition says that if AI is found guilty, its harmful features can be banned until safeguards are in place. But this is simply regulation in that sense, right? Governments already suspend products. Courts already issue things like injunctions, and regulators already require compliance frameworks. None of this requires AI to be a person, and therefore the benefit of this compliance exists on both sides. However, under their model of AI's features becoming the wrongdoer, on their side this is the case. However, on our side, the corporations remain responsible for the design, deployment, and the profit behind the use of that feature. So if harm is framed as a simple software glitch or a specific feature, then companies can patch it and move on without addressing or being harmed in the first place, right? Because we say that if you specifically focus on these features, you may not be necessarily preventing the companies from being harmed, being like held accountable. However, it would definitely shift the responsibility, as more likely than not, companies are more likely going to blame this AI for creating this solution rather than focusing on fixing it themselves or taking the blame, given that this is an option now. So then harm is then framed as a rather than a cooperative failure. It is then specifically an AI failure. The benefit here is redundant, right? Our impact is a stronger deterrence through real human accountability from these companies. Then going on to second class here, right, which is how accountability systems in that sense. Their strongest argument is that AI systems can post deployment with multiple algorithms, making it hard to trace the human intent. Therefore, AI must bear liability. However, we've already proved to you how complexity has never removed responsibility. And things like, in fact, AI personhood in that sense, with the risks that are in place, already have segregated liability, right? Corporations could then argue that emergent behavior on their side belongs to the AI entity, refusing blame in that sense. And victims, how on our side of the house, rather get enforceable defendants with real power and assets that can actually have real like retaliations. That on their side, however, corporations are then not held accountable, and these victims go toe to toe with AI, which don't necessarily receive or feel this harm in that sense. So the claim here is on additive accountability doesn't really make sense, because we already show that there is fragmented accountability in place and how real responsibility already exists. So their model creates the appearance of accountability, and our model preserves accountability, proving to you that a powerful tool does not necessarily create a responsible person inherently. And for this reason, we are so proud to host. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Now welcome the reply speech from proposition side. You have 3 minutes.
Okay. Okay. Can I be audible and visible?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Strip away the fear, strip away the science fiction. And this debate is about governance. One side gives you a system for accountability. The other gave you hope that existing laws somehow stretch far enough to avoid these AIs from being abused. Dear panel, today this debate comes down to one simple fact. Will AI run rampant and cause harm towards society, or will we take action to put an end to this harm and allow AI to be accountable? I will be doing two things today, telling you what opposition thinks in this today's debate and giving you a comparison at the end. Number one, opposition tells you that by saying AI has no moral agency, opposition tells you that AI has no moral agency, and what this means on side opposition is they tell you that AIs don't deserve. Is they tell you that corporations don't deserve legal personhood. Corporations that do have legal personhood, they don't deserve these. Companies cannot be trialed at court, and it is only the founders or owners of these companies that can be held accountable. Yeah, panel, you know what does that sound like? That's like Bill Gates must be put to prison just because Microsoft had a security breach recently. It's utterly ridiculous for you to make this comparison saying AI has no moral agency, but companies do not have moral urgency as well. Now, number two, I would like to tell you on how opposition side were confused at the point on who is at fault. They tell you that the developer has to be at fault for the harms committed by AI. We tell you that number one, why is it not the investor to be at fault? Why is it not the stakeholder of the company to be at fault? Why is it not the owner of the company to be at fault? Inside opposition's framing of today's debate, saying that the developer has to be at fault, they have to prove to you why is it the individual that coded the framework, why is it the individual that was given instruction from and higher up to be at fault in this entirety of this debate. So we tell you opposition was confused from the point of view that in their side of the house, in their problem statement, that the developer has to be at fault is inherently flawed. And we tell you another thing, that AI operates more unpredictably than the developer thought. We tell you in our side of the house, that's exactly why we have to make AI a legal personhood. We have to make AI hold accountable, because if it operates unpredictably than the developer, then the owner of the company, then you cannot completely blame those developers or companies in the first place. Okay, let me tell you this. Our worst case scenario, opposition side tells you if ChatGPT somehow kills 5 kids and apologizes to that mother, sorry, I killed 5 kids. We tell you on our side of the house, this ChatGPT will be held accountable. This ChatGPT, this version of ChatGPT will be banned from being used again. The features of ChatGPT that inherently killed 5 people will be inhibited to be used again. So we tell you, even in the worst case scenario that somehow miraculously the ChatGPT somehow kills 5 kids, problem will not occur. This problem will be overcome more easier on our side of the house. Now let me tell you that that's our worst case scenario. Their best case scenario is that these AI developers, these AI companies will be more ethical and develop more systems that create that follow the law and abide to policies. But we tell you on our side of the house, these AI systems and these AI regulations will be implemented much faster and much more effectively when we can directly imply laws and legislations towards these AI entities. And with all of that, vote for prop.